The clock reads 3 in the morning. He is awake, staring at the ceiling. It's not ordinary insomnia. It's the kind of wakefulness that comes when a question settles in your mind and refuses to leave. Does God exist? 4 words. Simple. Ancient. But in the silence of the early morning, they take on weight. Because it's not a theoretical question. It's personal. Urgent. As if the entire structure of reality depended on the answer. He tries to remember when he began to doubt. Maybe it was when his grandfather died. Maybe it was while reading a book. Maybe it wasn't at any specific moment, just a growing discomfort, a feeling that the answers he had received his whole life no longer fit. And worst of all, he is not alone in this wakefulness. Billions of people have asked this question. Brilliant philosophers have devoted their entire lives to it. Scientists, theologians, staunch atheists, fervent believers, all have looked up at the same night sky and wondered if there is someone on the other side. And after millennia of debate, sophisticated arguments, accumulated evidence, the question remains unanswered. This should be impossible. We live in the information age. We have mapped the human genome. We have photographed black holes. We have built artificial intelligence that simulates consciousness. But humanity's oldest question, the one that determines how billions live, govern, educate their children, and face death, remains unanswerable. Why? It's not for lack of intelligence. It's not for lack of effort. It's not because the question is irrelevant or poorly formulated. It's because there may be something in the very nature of this question that resists resolution. Something that reveals more about us, about our need for certainty, our fragility in the face of the unknown, our fear of emptiness, than about the existence or non-existence of a deity. This video won't give you the answer. If millennia of philosophy haven't solved it, 15 minutes of YouTube won't. But what this video can do is something more unsettling. Reveal why the question remains unanswered. And in doing so, show what that uncertainty says about the human condition. Because the real question isn't, does God exist? The real question is, why do you need an answer so badly? And what happens when you realize you may never have one? There is a specific kind of discomfort that only this question produces. It's not the discomfort of not knowing the answer to a math problem. It's not the frustration of not understanding how something works. It's existential. Because the question about God isn't just about information. It's about meaning. About whether your life has purpose beyond biological survival. About whether there is cosmic justice or whether murderers and saints have the same fate, decay and oblivion. About whether the love you feel has transcendent value or is just brain chemistry optimizing reproductive behavior. The question about God organizes the world. If God exists, certain things make sense. Suffering may have a hidden purpose. Morality has an objective foundation. Consciousness is not an accident. Death is not the absolute end. If God does not exist, other things make sense. The universe is indifferent. Morality is a human construct. Consciousness emerged from blind processes. Death is complete dissolution. Both views are internally consistent. Both organize the same facts into different narratives. And that is why the question does not go away. You may have grown up religious and abandoned your faith at age 20, but the question returns. In moments of crisis, on sleepless nights, when someone dies, when a child is born, when you look up at the starry sky and feel something. You don't know what, but you feel it. Or you may have grown up secular and never believed. But even so, there are moments when the possibility appears. A moment of inexplicable beauty. A coincidence that seems too meaningful. An experience that your rational mind cannot easily categorize. And then you find yourself thinking, what if? That what if is the silence that bothers you. Because it's not just epistemological doubt. I don't know if this is true. It's existential urgency. I need to know because my life depends on it. And here's the paradox. Modern science has given us answers to almost everything. How life began, why we have emotions, what happens in the brain when we make decisions. But the more we explain, the more the question of God becomes irreducible. Because God is not a scientific hypothesis. You cannot prove God empirically in the same way that you prove the existence of electrons. God by definition would be something beyond the physical. And methods for studying the physical do not reach the metaphysical. But you also cannot refute God empirically. You cannot conduct an experiment that proves that nothing exists beyond matter. All scientific observation presupposes naturalistic methods, and naturalistic methods, by design, do not detect the supernatural. So we are left in this strange space, neither proof nor refutation, just arguments, interpretations, conflicting intuitions. And this generates something rare in modern human experience. Uncertainty that cannot be resolved by more information. You can study all the philosophical arguments. You can read Thomas Aquinas, Kant, Nietzsche, Plantinga, Dawkins. You can examine cosmology, evolutionary biology, quantum physics, the neuroscience of religion, and in the end you will find equally intelligent, equally informed people reaching opposite conclusions. This shouldn't happen. If the question were purely factual, like is the earth round, more information would resolve it. But the question about God operates on a different level. It operates on assumptions about what counts as evidence, about what counts as a satisfactory explanation, about which intuitions are reliable, and those assumptions cannot be proven. They are the glasses through which we see evidence, and you cannot use glasses to examine the glasses themselves. That is why the question persists, not because we are stupid, not because we lack data, but because the question touches on something deeper than facts. It touches on how we interpret reality itself. And if that seems too abstract, go back to that man at 3 in the morning. He is not concerned with syllogisms. He is not making probabilistic calculations. He is just feeling the weight of not knowing, of living without certainty about the most important question he can ask, and realizing that maybe, just maybe, having to live with that uncertainty is part of what it means to be human. There are philosophers who say that this uncertainty is in fact a symptom of something deeper. Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish thinker, argued that anguish over the question of God is not a defect but a revelation. It shows that you are confronting your own finitude, your own inability to anchor meaning in something permanent and certain. He called this existential despair, the feeling of being suspended over the abyss with no firm ground beneath your feet. And for him, faith was not the resolution of this anguish through intellectual certainty. It was the leap, accepting to live without proof, without guarantee, trusting despite uncertainty. But here's the problem. Not everyone can make that leap, and not because they are cowards or dishonest, but because for many, faith without evidence seems arbitrary. Why believe in the Christian God and not in Allah? Why not Zeus, Brahman, or any other human construct? And Kierkegaard has no rational answer for that. For him, the choice is intimate, subjective, irreducible to logic, and that deeply disturbs the modern mind. Because we have been trained to think that important questions must have rational answers, that persistent uncertainty means we haven't figured out enough yet. That if we keep searching, we will eventually resolve it. But what if we don't? What if the question about God is, by its very nature, unresolvable through pure reason? What if it is the kind of question where the answer depends less on logic and more on choice, on commitment, on how you decide to live in the face of uncertainty? This is not relativism. It is not saying that all answers are equally valid. It is recognizing that there may be limits to what reason can achieve, and that beyond those limits, other faculties, intuition, experience, trust, hope, need to come into play. But before accepting this, it is worth trying to understand, why is the rational answer so difficult? Why do arguments that seem logical to some sound empty to others? Let's start where reason always begins when seeking the absolute. There is an argument about God that seems at first glance irrefutable. It begins with an observation so obvious that it almost seems trivial. Things exist. You exist. The universe exists. It is not a hallucination. It is not an illusion. There is something, not nothing. And here is the question that destroys any attempt to sleep peacefully. Why? Why is there something rather than nothing? This question is different from how do things work or where did we come from. You can answer those with science, the Big Bang, evolution, physical processes. But the question, why is there something, comes first. It is more fundamental. Because even if you explain the Big Bang, someone may ask, and why were the conditions right for the Big Bang to happen? Why the laws of physics? Why energy? Why possibility instead of absolute impossibility? This is the cosmological argument, and it has haunted philosophy for centuries. The structure is simple. Everything that exists has a cause or explanation. The universe exists. Therefore, the universe has a cause or explanation. That final cause, that which explains everything without needing explanation, is what we call God. And here's why this argument is powerful. It appeals to a deep intuition. In your everyday experience, nothing simply exists without reason. Your phone was manufactured. You were begotten by your parents. The mountain was formed by geological processes. There is no effect without a cause. There is no phenomenon without an explanation. Extrapolating this to the entire universe seems logical. Leibniz, a 17th century philosopher, formulated this as the principle of sufficient reason. Everything that exists must have a reason or explanation for its existence. There can be no raw facts, things that simply are, without why. And if you accept this principle, it seems impossible to escape God, because you can regress through the causes. The universe caused by the Big Bang caused by quantum fluctuation caused by the quantum field. But at some point you have to stop. You have to arrive at something that has no external cause, and that something, say theists, is God. But there is a problem, a giant problem, a problem that atheist philosophers immediately point out. If everything needs a cause, who caused God? Theists respond, God is different. God is eternal, necessary, self-existent. God did not begin to exist, so he does not need a cause. And atheists retort, if you can make an exception for God, why not make an exception for the universe? Why can't the universe be eternal, necessary, self-existent? That's the trap, the hidden circularity. You start with the premise everything needs an explanation, and end up saying except God who doesn't. But if you can make exceptions, the initial premise collapses. And if you can't make exceptions, then God also needs an explanation, and you enter into infinite regression. Bertrand Russell, in a famous debate with theologian Frederick Copleston in the 1920s, said something brutal in its simplicity. The universe just is there, and that's all. No ultimate explanation, no metaphysical foundation, no first cause, just raw existence. Does that bother you? It should. Because accepting that the universe just exists without reason violates all your intuitions about causality. It seems arbitrary, unsatisfactory, like stopping asking why when you should keep asking. But accepting that God just exists has the same problem. It just shifts the arbitrariness one level up. Theists respond, but God is different. God is necessary. He exists in all possible worlds. He couldn't not exist. The universe is contingent. It could have not existed. And atheists ask, how do you know God is necessary? How do you know the universe isn't necessary? You're just defining God as necessary to escape the problem, but definitions don't create reality. And here's what makes this debate irresolvable. It's not about facts. It's about which exception seems less arbitrary. For the theist, it makes more sense to accept a conscious, intentional personal being as the foundation than to accept that blind matter energy just is there. Mind seems more fundamental than matter. Purpose seems more fundamental than chance. For the atheist, it makes more sense to accept that the physical universe just is there than to invent an invisible, non-physical, infinitely complex entity to explain the physical. Ontological simplicity. Fewer entities, the better. Why add an extra layer, God, when the universe could be the foundation? And neither side can prove that their intuition is right. Because what is at stake is not pure logic. It is what kind of explanation you find satisfactory. And that is shaped by assumptions deeper than logic itself. Do you see the universe as something that requires personal, intentional explanation, or as a raw fact that simply is? That answer doesn't come from reasoning. It comes from intuition about the nature of reality. And intuitions can't be proven, only felt as obvious or not. But there's another argument, one that doesn't start with, why does anything exist? But with, why does everything seem so finely tuned? Look around you. Your eye captures light, focuses images, transmits signals to your brain, which constructs visual representations in real time. Your heart pumps blood accurately for decades without you thinking about it. Your DNA contains instructions for building you. Billions of base pairs organized in a way that generates liver, neurons, antibodies. This seems designed. And for centuries, this was considered proof of God. William Paley, an 18th century theologian, put it perfectly. If you find a watch on the ground, you don't assume it formed by chance. You infer a watchmaker. And if a watch implies design, what about an eye, infinitely more complex? This is the teleological argument. From the Greek telos, purpose, end. And it is intuitively powerful, because it seems obvious that functional complexity indicates intelligence behind it. Until 1859. Until Darwin. Because Darwin showed something devastating to the design argument. Natural selection can produce the appearance of design without a designer. Random variations, selective pressure, deep time. These three ingredients, repeated over millions of years, produce eyes, wings, brains, without anyone planning it. It's not magic. It's brutal statistics. Organisms with advantageous mutations survive more, reproduce more, spread those mutations. Organisms with disadvantageous mutations die. Repeat this a billion times and you get apparent design emerging from a blind process. Richard Dawkins called this the blind watchmaker, a process that appears to have purpose but does not. And here's why this was so destructive to the argument. Because it eliminated the logical need for a designer. You no longer need to invoke God to explain eyes, wings, instincts. Evolution is sufficient. But is it? Because there is something Darwin does not explain. Darwin explains biological design, but he does not explain cosmological fine-tuning. And here's where it gets disturbing. Physicists discovered in the 20th century that the universe is tuned with absurd precision to allow life. The cosmological constant, the force that governs the expansion of the universe, is tuned with a precision of 1 part in 10 or 120. If it were slightly larger, the universe would have expanded too fast to form galaxies. Slightly smaller, it would have collapsed before stars could form. Strong nuclear force, which holds protons together in the atomic nucleus. If it were 2% stronger, there would be no hydrogen. 5% weaker, there would be no carbon. And without carbon, there is no organic chemistry. There is no life. Ratio between the mass of the electron and the proton. Intensity of gravitational force. Initial expansion rate of the universe. The list goes on. More than 20 fundamental physical constants that, if they were even slightly different, would produce a sterile universe. No stars, no planets, no complex atoms. And we live in a universe where all these constants are perfectly tuned. Coincidence? For many physicists and philosophers, no. Roger Penrose, a Nobel Prize-winning mathematical physicist, calculated the probability of a universe with our level of order arising by chance. 1 in 10, 123. This number is so small that it cannot be written even if you used all the atoms in the universe as digits. So there are two main explanations. 1. God intentionally adjusted the constants to allow life. 2. There are infinite universes, multiverse, with random constants. And we are obviously in the universe where the constants allow observers. And here's the impasse. For theists, the multiverse is extravagant speculation. Inventing trillions of invisible, unobservable universes just to avoid admitting design seems intellectually dishonest. It's like explaining the clock by saying that there are infinite piles of sand, and in one of them, by chance, the grains organize themselves into a clock. For atheists, God is extravagant speculation. Inventing an invisible, omnipotent, omniscient being to explain constants seems like wishful thinking. It is projecting human intentionality on a cosmic scale without justification. And again, you cannot decide between these explanations using logic alone. You need to decide which type of explanation seems more reasonable. God or multiverse, mind or chance, intent or statistical necessity. And that decision is shaped by something deeper than arguments, by intuitions about what is simple, what is plausible, what is satisfying as a final explanation. Here is the pattern that is emerging. Arguments about God are not like arguments about empirical facts. They operate on a layer where philosophical assumptions determine conclusions. If you think mind is more fundamental than matter, God seems plausible. If you think matter is more fundamental than mind, naturalism seems plausible. If you think purpose needs intentional explanation, design points to a designer. If you think purpose can emerge from blind processes, design does not imply a designer. No argument can prove which assumption is correct, because these assumptions are the criteria you use to evaluate arguments. They come before the arguments. They are the glasses through which you view evidence. And that means that reason alone cannot resolve the question about God. It can clarify. It can expose contradictions. It can show implications. But it cannot force a single conclusion. So maybe the problem isn't that we need better arguments. Maybe the problem is that we're asking the wrong kind of question. Because if God is not a logical conclusion derived from premises, maybe God is a moral necessity. Not something you deduce, but something you need for the world to make ethical sense. There's a phrase that many people know, even without knowing where it comes from. Dostoevsky, a 19th century Russian writer, put it in the mouth of a character. If God does not exist, everything is permitted. It is not a logical argument. It is an existential diagnosis. Because what Dostoevsky was capturing was not a rational deduction, but a deep fear. If there is no God, there is no objective basis for morality. There is no absolute right or wrong, only changeable human conventions, cultural preferences, power deciding what is acceptable. And that is terrifying. Not because you want to do immoral things and need God to stop you, but because you feel it in the fiber of your being that some things are objectively wrong. Torturing children for fun is wrong. Not wrong according to my culture. Not wrong according to my personal preference. Wrong. Period. And if someone disagrees, you don't think, how interesting, we have different opinions. You think this person is morally blind, lacking perception of something real. This is the moral argument for God, and it doesn't work like the previous ones. It doesn't try to prove that God exists through abstract logic about causes or design. It appeals to something more visceral, your direct moral experience. The structure is simple. There are objective moral values, things that are right or wrong regardless of human opinion. If there is no God, there is no basis for objective moral values. Therefore, God exists. And here's why many people find this argument convincing. Because it connects with lived experience. You feel that genocide is wrong, not because your culture says so, but because it violates something fundamental about human dignity. And that intuition seems to point to a moral reality that transcends human convention. C.S. Lewis, a 20th century writer and Christian apologist, built an entire book on this. He noticed that when people argue, they appeal to a standard that both recognize. They don't just say, "I didn't like what you did." They say what you did was unfair, and they expect the other person to understand. This suggests that morality is not just a personal preference, like a taste for chocolate. It is something objective that both can be right or wrong about. And if morality is objective, where does it come from? Physical laws do not generate duties. Atoms have no morality. Evolutionary processes explain why we feel certain things are moral, but they do not explain why those things are moral. Evolution explains why cooperation was advantageous, why we developed empathy, a sense of justice, punishment of cheaters. But explaining the origin of moral feelings is not the same as explaining the truth of moral judgments. Analogy. Evolution explains why we developed visual perception, but it does not prove that the external world does not exist. Evolution gave us eyes because the external world is real, and perceiving it helped us survive. Similarly, perhaps evolution gave us moral intuitions because objective morality is real, and perceiving it, at least partially, helped with cooperation. But where does this objective morality come from? Atheists respond, it doesn't have to come from anywhere. Moral facts can be raw, like mathematical facts. 2 + 2 = 4, not because God decided it, but because it is a necessary truth. Similarly, torturing innocents is wrong, not because God forbids it, but because it is a necessary moral truth. And theists ask, but mathematical facts are abstract. They don't make demands on you. Morality does. Morality says you must act in a certain way. And duties seem to require authority, someone with the right to command. Abstract facts don't command. People command. Here's the impasse again. For theists, objective morality requires a personal foundation. It requires a moral lawgiver, God, whose perfectly good nature defines what is good and whose commands create obligations. For atheists, objective morality can exist as a brute fact about the properties of conscious beings. Rational beings have inherent dignity, rights, value, not because God gave them these things, but because these properties supervene on rationality, consciousness, and the capacity to suffer. And again, there is no way to prove which view is right using pure argument, because what is at stake is, what do you accept as an adequate foundation for morality? If you think morality needs a personal legislator, God seems necessary. If you think morality can be an impersonal truth, God seems unnecessary. But there is something deeper going on here, something that Dostoevsky understood better than many philosophers. Because the moral argument isn't really about logic. It's about anguish. It's about the fear that if God doesn't exist, there's nothing holding society together except power. That morality is just a fancy word for what the strongest impose. That the Nazis weren't wrong, they just lost the war. And you don't want to live in a world like that. You want there to be something beyond human convention. Something that makes certain actions truly reprehensible, not just unpopular. Something that validates your moral outrage when you see injustice. And God offers that. God offers anchorage. He offers assurance that the universe is not morally neutral, that there is cosmic justice, that good has a real foundation. But here's the problem. Needing something to be true doesn't make it true. You may desperately want God to exist to ground morality. You may feel that without God, everything falls apart. But what if it does fall apart? What if morality is a human construct, useful, important, but not grounded in anything transcendent? This possibility is so disturbing that many cannot even consider it seriously. It is easier to assume that because morality seems objective, it must be objective. And because it seems to need a transcendent foundation, that foundation must exist. But perhaps objectivity is an illusion. Perhaps it is a consensus so deep that it seems like metaphysical truth. All cultures prohibit the murder of members of the group because groups that allowed this would not survive. All value courage, basic honesty, care for children, because societies without these values collapse, not because they are cosmic truths engraved in the structure of the universe, but because they are conditions of possibility for human society. And perhaps that is enough. Maybe you don't need God to condemn genocide. Maybe it's enough to recognize that conscious beings can suffer, that suffering is bad, that inflicting unnecessary suffering violates the kind of beings we want to be. This is not cheap relativism. It is recognizing that morality is rooted in facts about consciousness, suffering, human flourishing, not in divine command. But theists have a powerful counter-argument. Okay, you can have morality without God. But can you have objective morality without God? Because without God, morality based on human well-being is, well, based on humans. And humans are contingent. We might not have existed. Other conscious beings might have radically different psychologies. So moral values change depending on which conscious beings exist. They are not absolute. They are relative to specific forms of life. And that means that Nazis in fact were not objectively wrong. They were wrong according to our values. But if they had won and established different values, there would be no independent standard to judge them by. And that seems morally intolerable. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The moral argument doesn't settle the question about God. It just reveals what's at stake. It reveals that belief or disbelief in God is deeply intertwined with how you understand morality, justice, meaning. It reveals that you are not just asking, does God exist, in the abstract. You are asking, can I live in a world without a transcendent moral foundation? And the answer to that second question does not come from philosophy. It comes from how you deal with the possibility that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to right and wrong. That morality is a fragile, precious, but human construct, not cosmic law. Some find this idea liberating. It means that humans are responsible for creating and upholding values, that there is no external authority dictating what is good. Others find it terrifying. It means there is no safety net, that if humans decide to abandon values, nothing will stop them. And this is where the moral argument really bites, not in logic, but in its existential implication. Because if God does not exist, then that man at 3 a.m. must face not only uncertainty about divinity, but uncertainty about whether anything has objective meaning. And maybe that's what keeps him awake. Not the intellectual question, does God exist? But the visceral question, if he doesn't exist, how can I bear to live in a morally empty universe? But there is something even more disturbing than this moral uncertainty. There is the direct experience of unjustified suffering, of cruelty without purpose, of pain that teaches nothing, builds no character, serves no greater plan. And that is where all arguments in favor of God find their greatest challenge. Because if God exists, why is the world like this? There is a kind of suffering that breaks any attempt at explanation. It is not the suffering you understand. It is not the pain that comes from bad choices, that teaches lessons, that builds resilience. It is suffering that makes no sense at all. A 4-year-old child diagnosed with bone cancer, excruciating pain, torturous treatments, parents praying desperately, and in the end, after months of agony, the child dies anyway. No spiritual growth, no visible purpose, just suffering, terror, and death. And if God exists, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, why? Why allow it? This is the problem of evil. And it is not an abstract academic argument, it is an existential cry. It is Ivan Karamazov, Dostoevsky's character, saying that even if there is cosmic harmony, even if the suffering of innocent children is necessary for some greater good, he returns the ticket. He refuses to participate in a universe built on the tears of children, because there is something deeply wrong with allowing atrocious suffering as a means to a greater end. And if God allows this, if God could prevent it but chooses not to, then God is not good, not in the way we understand goodness. The logical structure is simple. If God is omnipotent, he can prevent all suffering. If God is omniscient, he knows about all suffering. If God is perfectly good, he wants to prevent all suffering. Suffering exists, therefore God does not exist, or at least does not have all these attributes simultaneously. And theists have spent centuries trying to resolve this. They have developed theodicies, justifications for why God allows evil. The most common, free will. God created humans free. Genuine freedom requires the possibility of choosing evil. Much of the suffering in the world comes from bad human choices, wars, murders, cruelty. God allows this because he values freedom more than preventing consequences. And that seems to explain moral suffering. Suffering caused by humans. But it does not explain natural suffering. Earthquakes that kill thousands. Genetic diseases that condemn babies. Parasites that eat their hosts alive from the inside out. None of this comes from human free will. So theists offer another theodicy, soul building. God created a world with suffering because suffering develops virtues. You don't learn courage without danger. You don't learn compassion without seeing suffering. You don't develop character without adversity. And perhaps God values developed souls more than constant happiness. But here's the problem. How much suffering is necessary? Do you need the Holocaust to develop virtue? Do you need children dying of cancer? Do you need parasites that slowly blind African children? The amount and intensity of suffering in the world seems to vastly exceed what is necessary for any soul building. And there's worse. Much suffering destroys souls rather than building them. People broken by trauma. People who become cruel after suffering greatly. People who die before any virtue can develop. If the point is soul building, the system is failing miserably. So theists try another way out. Theistic skepticism. Basically, you cannot understand the ways of God. God is infinitely wise. Perhaps all this suffering serves purposes you cannot comprehend. Perhaps it prevents greater suffering. Perhaps it generates greater goods. You simply don't have the perspective to judge. And that's convenient. because it makes the theist position unfalsifiable. Any suffering, no matter how horrible, can be explained away as God's mystery. Any objection can be dismissed as human incomprehension. But here's the cost. If you can't use suffering as evidence against God because of divine mysteries, then you also can't use order, beauty, or goodness as evidence for God. Because maybe God has mysterious reasons for creating a universe that seems orderly but isn't, or reasons for allowing you to think there is objective morality when there isn't. Mystery works both ways, and if you embrace mystery completely, then God's goodness becomes an empty word, compatible with any observation, including the torture of innocence. And that is not a defense of God. It is an evacuation of meaning. But there is another aspect of the problem that is even more personal, even more painful: God's silence. Because if God exists and loves humanity, why does he hide? That woman kneeling in prayer for 30 years, asking for just one sign, one confirmation, anything to show that someone is listening, and receiving nothing. Silence. If God wants a relationship with humans, why make his existence so ambiguous? Why leave billions searching without finding? Theists respond, God has revealed himself. In nature, in conscience, in the Bible, in Jesus. The problem is not that God is hiding. It's that humans refuse to see. But that doesn't hold water. Because there are sincere, honest people desperately searching for God and finding nothing convincing. Not because they are arrogant. Not because they love sin. But because the evidence seems insufficient. And if God is love, if God wants people to know him, why make it so difficult? Why not appear publicly? Why not heal amputees? Why not answer prayers in a verifiable way? Theists say, God wants faith, not compulsion. If God appeared obviously, you would be forced to believe. It would not be free choice. But that's absurd. Parents reveal their existence to their children without destroying their freedom. Knowing that someone exists is not the same as being forced to love them. Disciples knew Jesus, saw miracles, and yet Judas betrayed him. Thomas doubted. Peter denied him. Evidence does not destroy freedom. So why doesn't God offer clear evidence today? And here is where the problem of evil meets the problem of divine hiddenness. If God allows horrible suffering and remains hidden, what does that say about God? Either God cannot prevent it, he is not omnipotent, or God does not know, he is not omniscient, or God does not care, he is not good, or God does not exist. And all of these options are devastating to traditional theism. Many have lost their faith right here. Charles Darwin abandoned Christianity not because of evolution, but because his 10-year-old daughter died of a painful illness. He couldn't believe in a benevolent God who would create a world with so much unnecessary suffering. Mother Teresa, after her death, revealed that she spent decades feeling a complete absence of God, praying into emptiness, serving while doubting if anyone was listening. And millions of anonymous people go through the same experience. They suffer senseless tragedies. They seek divine comfort. They find silence. And they realize that maybe, just maybe, no one is there. That maybe the reason God does not prevent suffering is not some mysterious plan, but absence. Here's what makes the problem of evil so devastating. It's not just a logical argument. It's lived experience that contradicts a good God. You can come up with sophisticated theodicies. You can invoke free will, soul-building, divine mysteries. But when you're holding a dying child, when you're burying a young spouse, when you're living through trauma that has broken you, those explanations sound empty. They sound like academic philosophy divorced from the brutal reality of suffering. And you realize that if God exists, either he is not as powerful as they say, or he is not as good as they say, or he operates in ways so incomprehensible that worshipping him seems absurd. But what if you still want to believe? What if abandoning God seems to lose the last shred of meaning? Then you face an impossible choice. Accept faith despite contrary evidence, or abandon faith and face a universe without purpose, without justice, without transcendent consolation. And neither option is easy. Neither option solves the pain, because the real question is not intellectual. It is existential. How do you live after suffering has shattered your certainties? What if the question was never meant to be answered with certainty? What if the very nature of the question about God is that it resists rational resolution? This is not evasion. It is not an excuse for lazy thinking. It is recognizing something profound about the limits of reason. Because so far you have seen sophisticated arguments on both sides. Cosmological, teleological, moral, the problem of evil, each with strengths, each with weaknesses. And in the end, none definitively resolves the question. So what do? You choose. Not based on proof, not based on certainty, but based on what exactly? Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish philosopher, said something radical. Faith is not a logical conclusion. It is a leap. You examine evidence, you weigh arguments, and in the end, you find that evidence is ambiguous. Arguments balance each other out. Reason cannot take you all the way to the answer, and so you leap. You choose to believe or not to believe despite the uncertainty, not because you have proven it, but because you need to live. And living requires commitment. And for Kierkegaard, that's not a flaw. It's the point. Because if God could be proven, if God's existence were as certain as 2 + 2, then faith would be unnecessary. You don't have faith in obvious facts. You have faith precisely when certainty escapes you. And maybe, just maybe, God values that leap more than intellectual assent forced by irrefutable logic. But here's the problem. If faith is a leap beyond reason, why leap to the Christian God specifically? Why not Allah? Why not Brahman? Why not any deity you invent? Kierkegaard has no objective answer. For him, choice is radically subjective. You leap to what resonates most deeply with you, what transforms your life most authentically. And that deeply disturbs the modern mind, because it seems to make truth arbitrary. It seems to say, believe whatever you want, as long as you're passionate about it. But truth shouldn't depend on passion. Truth should be truth, regardless of how you feel about it. Blaise Pascal, a 17th century French mathematician and philosopher, tried a different approach. He agreed that you can't prove God rationally. Evidence is ambiguous. Arguments aren't universally convincing. But he said, that doesn't mean you shouldn't believe. Because even without certainty, you can make a pragmatic calculation. Pascal's famous wager. If you believe in God and God exists, you gain infinity, heaven. If you believe in God and God does not exist, you lose finity, perhaps some earthly pleasures. If you do not believe in God and God exists, you lose infinity, hell. If you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, you gain finite, freedom of religion. Mathematically, betting on God is rational. Even if the probability is low, infinite gain multiplied by any probability is still infinite. It outweighs any finite loss. And that seems convincing, but there are obvious problems. First, which God? Christianity promises heaven. Islam promises paradise for Muslims and threatens Christians with hell. Hinduism offers moksha through different paths. You can't bet on all of them. They contradict each other. So Pascal's wager doesn't point to God. It points to choosing one religion among many, and it offers no criteria for which one to choose. Second, can you choose to believe? Belief is not voluntary. You don't decide to believe in the table in front of you. You simply believe because you see it. Similarly, you can't simply decide to believe in God out of pragmatic calculation. Genuine belief requires conviction, not strategic betting. Pascal knew this. He said, start by acting as if you believe. Go to church, pray, read scripture. Over time, practice cultivates genuine belief. But that sounds like deliberate self-deception, intentional conditioning to believe something you are not convinced is true, and there is something deeply problematic about that. Third, would God reward that? If God exists and is good, God values honesty, sincerity, genuine pursuit of truth. Would that God be impressed by someone who believes only because pragmatic betting suggests it? By someone doing a cost-benefit analysis on eternity? It seems not. It seems that belief motivated by fear of punishment or desire for reward is exactly the wrong kind of belief. William James, an American philosopher, offered a more sophisticated version. He said, when you face a genuine option, a choice that is alive, both possibilities seem real. Momentous, it matters deeply. And forced, you must choose a side. You have the right to let passion decide. God is a genuine option. Both possibilities seem alive. Some believe, others do not. Both are intelligent people. It is momentous. It affects how you live, die, understand meaning. It is forced. Not choosing is choosing not to believe in practice. So when reason cannot decide, James says, you can legitimately let hope, desire, emotional need influence your choice, but only when reason is genuinely ambiguous. If the evidence clearly points against God, you cannot believe just because you want to. That would be intellectually dishonest. But if the evidence is balanced, arguments on each side have strength, then choice based on pragmatic and emotional considerations is legitimate. And here's where it gets interesting. Is the evidence balanced? For James, yes. For many atheists, no. The evidence clearly points against God. The problem of evil, divine hiddenness, lack of verifiable miracles, successful naturalistic explanations. For them, believing in God despite this evidence is not a legitimate leap. It is denial. And for many theists, evidence clearly points to God. Fine-tuning, consciousness, objective morality, transformative religious experiences. For them, not believing would be denial. So we're back to the same place. Evaluating evidence depends on assumptions that evidence cannot prove. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the question about God isn't the kind of question that reason alone can solve, not because reason is flawed, but because the question operates in territory where reason reaches its limits. You examine arguments, you weigh evidence, and you find that both sides have legitimate points. Both sides have unresolved problems. And in the end, you have to live. You have to decide how to organize your life, what values to follow, how to face death, what hopes to hold. And those decisions imply a position on God, even if you don't articulate it. If you live as if the universe has purpose, as if morality is objective, as if death is not the absolute end, you are living as if theism is true. If you live as if the universe is indifferent, as if morality is a human construct, as if death is complete dissolution, you are living as if naturalism is true. You cannot avoid an existential position, and perhaps recognizing this is more honest than pretending you have reached a purely rational conclusion. Because the truth is, reason clarifies options, but it does not force choice. In the end, you choose based on who you are, what you value, what you can bear to believe. And that choice is not purely rational, it is existential. It is about what kind of person you want to be, what kind of world you want to inhabit, what kind of hope you can maintain. And maybe that's what Kierkegaard was trying to say. Faith is not a cognitive defect. It is an existential response to irreducible uncertainty. It is saying, I don't know for sure, but I choose to live as if. And disbelief is also an existential choice. It is saying, I don't know for sure, but I choose to live assuming there isn't. Neither choice is more rational than the other if the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Both are bets on the nature of reality that you cannot prove. And perhaps the only real difference is, which uncertainty can you bear? The uncertainty of living without God, without cosmic purpose, without ultimate justice, without transcendent consolation? Or the uncertainty of living with faith, without proof, without guarantee, betting everything on something that may be an illusion? There is something deeply unsettling about realizing that people smarter than you, people who have studied more, thought more deeply, analyzed evidence more rigorously, come to completely opposite conclusions. We're not talking about trivial disagreement. We are talking about philosophers of the highest caliber, award winners, authors of works that have shaped civilization, and they look at the same arguments, the same evidence, the same philosophical problems, and half conclude that God clearly exists, and half conclude that God clearly does not exist. How is this possible? If the question were purely factual, if it were like discovering whether electrons exist or whether DNA is a double helix structure, more research, more evidence, more rigor would eventually produce consensus. But that has not happened. Millennia of philosophy, centuries of science, decades of sophisticated academic debate, and the disagreement persists. That should tell us something important. Not that the question has no answer, but that perhaps the answer is not accessible through methods that normally resolve disagreements. Because what is happening here is not that one side has evidence that the other ignores. It is that both sides interpret the same evidence through different lenses. And those lenses, those fundamental assumptions, precede the arguments. They determine what counts as evidence, what counts as a satisfactory explanation, what seems plausible versus absurd. Let's be specific. Consider the cosmological argument. Why is there something rather than nothing? For the theist, the question demands an answer. It seems obvious that existence requires explanation, and God, a necessary self-existent being, provides that explanation. For the atheist, the question is ill-formed. The universe simply exists is not a problem that needs solving. It is a brute fact, and invoking God doesn't help because it only shifts the question, why does God exist? Which intuition is right? You can't prove it, because the intuition about whether existence needs an external explanation is an assumption, not a conclusion. If you think reality must have an ultimate foundation, God seems necessary. If you think reality is the ultimate foundation, God seems unnecessary. And no argument can force someone to change their fundamental assumption or consider the problem of evil. For an atheist, the gratuitous suffering of innocence is devastating evidence against a good and powerful God. It seems obvious that a good God would prevent this. For the theist, suffering is compatible with God through free will, purposes that transcend human understanding, or the value of a universe with regular natural laws. It seems obvious that finite humans cannot judge the strategies of an infinite being. Which intuition is right? You cannot prove it, because intuition about how much suffering is too much, about what justifications are acceptable, is a presupposition, not a conclusion. If you think intense suffering without visible purpose refutes God, you conclude atheism. If you think God may have reasons beyond human comprehension, you maintain theism. And no argument can force someone to adopt a different criterion. Here's the pattern. Fundamental assumptions determine conclusions. And those assumptions don't come from pure logic. They come from deep intuitions about the nature of reality that you feel are obvious, but that someone else may not feel. Thomas Kuhn, philosopher of science, showed that this happens even in science. When scientific paradigms change, such as from Newtonian physics to relativity, it is not just that new evidence appears. It is that scientists begin to see the world differently. Same data, radically different interpretations. And the transition does not happen by pure logic. It happens because a new generation grows up in the new paradigm and finds it more natural. Something similar happens with God. Theism and atheism are different paradigms for interpreting reality. Within the theistic paradigm, certain things make sense. Objective morality, cosmic purpose, apparent design pointing to a designer, consciousness as more than matter. Within the atheistic paradigm, other things make sense. Morality as an evolutionary construct, purpose as a human projection, design as natural selection, consciousness as an emergent property. And you cannot prove which paradigm is right using tools from the paradigm itself, because each paradigm defines what counts as proof. But there is another factor, perhaps a deeper one. Personal experiences shape plausibility. If you have had an experience that you interpreted as an encounter with God, a moment of divine presence, a prayer answered in a seemingly supernatural way, a transformation that you attribute to grace, then the cosmological argument is not being evaluated in a vacuum. It is being evaluated within a context where you have already experienced something that seems to confirm that God exists. So when someone says, the universe can exist without explanation, it seems absurd. Because you know, or think you know, that there is something beyond the physical universe. You have experienced it. On the other hand, if you have never had an experience that seemed transcendent, if prayers have always seemed like talking to emptiness, if a sincere search for God has produced only silence, then the cosmological argument is being evaluated within a context where God seems absent. So when someone says God is a necessary explanation, it seems like projection. Because you've never detected evidence of God, so why assume he exists? And here's the problem. Both experiences are valid within their own perspectives. A person who has experienced God is not lying or delusional necessarily. People who have never experienced God are not being blind or hard-hearted necessarily. They have simply lived different lives that have produced different experiential data, and that data shapes what seems plausible. There is also a cultural factor. If you grew up in a society where theism is the norm, where everyone around you believes, where religious narratives structure meaning, then atheism is what needs extraordinary justification. If you grew up in a secular society, where religion is marginal, where scientific narratives structure meaning, then theism is what needs extraordinary justification. And this is not necessarily an irrational bias. It is recognizing that social consensus has epistemic value. Billions of people throughout history have believed in the transcendent. This may be evidence that they are detecting something real, or evidence that humans have a universal psychological tendency to believe. Which interpretation you choose depends on prior assumptions about whether consensus indicates truth or bias. And there is a psychological factor. Some people have a high tolerance for uncertainty. They can live comfortably without definitive answers to ultimate questions. For them, agnosticism seems rational. I don't know if God exists. Maybe I'll never know. And that's okay. Other people have a low tolerance for uncertainty. They need answers, even if provisional, to organize their lives. For them, agnosticism seems intolerable. I need to know whether the universe has a purpose or not. I need to choose a side. And this psychological, not logical difference influences conclusions. People with low tolerance for uncertainty may adopt theism or atheism with more conviction than the evidence warrants. People with high tolerance may remain agnostic even when the evidence seems to point slightly in one direction. Neither is necessarily being irrational. They are just applying different epistemic values. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Disagreement about God is not primarily about evidence. It is about philosophical assumptions that evidence cannot resolve, personal experiences that cannot be directly shared, epistemic values about how much weight to give to different types of considerations, psychological factors about tolerance for uncertainty, cultural contexts that shape what seems plausible, and none of these factors are purely rational. That doesn't mean belief in God is irrational, nor does it mean disbelief is irrational. It means that rationality alone does not determine conclusion. Equally rational people, with access to the same information, can reasonably reach different conclusions because they start from different places and value different things. And recognizing this should generate humility. The humility to realize that your conclusion about God, whatever it may be, is not as obviously correct as it seems, that intelligent, sincere, informed people disagree with you, and that maybe, just maybe, They are not stupid or dishonest. Maybe they simply inhabit a different paradigm, have had different experiences, apply different epistemic values, and maybe this is inevitable when the question touches on the foundations of reality where reason reaches its limits. But here's what this realization should not do. It should not lead you to conclude that all opinions are equally valid. It should not make you abandon the search for truth. It should not make you embrace cheap relativism. Because even if disagreement is to be expected, even if assumptions shape conclusions, there are still better and worse arguments. There are still beliefs that are internally contradictory. There are still positions that ignore relevant evidence. There is still reasoning that is simply flawed. The point is not that everything is subjective. The point is that the question is genuinely difficult. Difficult in a way that allows for persistent rational disagreement. And perhaps having to live with this difficulty, with this irreducible uncertainty, is part of what it means to be human. Part of what it means to face questions that matter deeply but resist definitive resolution. And perhaps the real question is not does God exist, but rather, how do I live well in the face of this uncertainty? That man at 3 a.m, remember him? He is still awake, but something has changed. Not because he has found an answer, not because the anguish has disappeared, but because he has begun to understand something that seemed impossible before. Perhaps the question has no answer, not because it is invalid, not because it doesn't matter, but because it is the kind of question that transcends human ability to resolve with certainty. And perhaps this is not a flaw in the universe. Perhaps it is a characteristic of human existence. Because there are two kinds of questions in the world. Closed questions, those that have definitive answers that you can discover through appropriate methods. What is the structure of DNA? You conduct experiments, analyze data, discover. What is the capital of France? You consult facts, verify. How does photosynthesis work? You study biochemistry, understand the mechanism. These questions are solvable, and once solved, they remain solved. There is no persistent rational disagreement among informed people. But there is another type, open questions, those that touch on the foundations of reality in ways that resist definitive resolution. What makes life meaningful? Is there free will? Is morality objective? Does God exist? And these questions matter more than any closed question, because they determine how you live, what values you follow, how you face suffering and death. But they have no answers that you can simply discover through method. You must choose an answer through an existential commitment that goes beyond what reason can force. Albert Camus, a 20th century French philosopher, understood this deeply. He wrote about the absurd, the contradiction between human need for meaning and the silent indifference of the universe. We want existence to have purpose. We want justice to be real. We want effort to matter cosmically. But the universe, at least the universe that science reveals, offers no guarantees. It does not promise that good will triumph. It does not promise that suffering has meaning. It does not promise that you matter in the cosmic scheme. And for Camus, confronting this reality honestly, without fleeing to comfortable illusions, is a fundamental human condition. He told the story of Sisyphus, a man condemned to roll a boulder to the top of a mountain, only to see it roll back down eternally. Meaningless work, effort without reward, purposeless repetition. And Camus says, we must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because there is a hidden purpose, not because he will eventually be rewarded, but because he chooses to find meaning in the effort itself. He rebels against absurdity by living fully in spite of it. And perhaps that applies here. Perhaps the question about God is absurd, in the technical sense. You will never know for sure. The evidence will remain ambiguous. Arguments will remain balanced. And you can do two things with that. First option, run away. Pretend you are certain when you are not. Adopt dogmatic belief, theistic or atheistic, and refuse to engage honestly with doubt. Build defensive walls around your position and attack anyone who questions it. This is tempting, because living with uncertainty is uncomfortable. We want stability. We want to know we are right. But running away from uncertainty through dogmatism is intellectual dishonesty. It is bad faith in existentialist language. It is lying to yourself about the reality of your situation. Second option, embrace it. Acknowledge the uncertainty honestly. Admit that you don't know for sure, and still choose how to live. Not because you have proven that your choice is right, but because you need to live. And living requires compromises. You choose to believe in God, not with arrogant certainty, but with faith that is conscious of being a gamble. Or you choose to live without God, not with arrogant certainty, but with the recognition that it is a gamble on the nature of reality. And both choices are legitimate if made with honesty and humility. Kierkegaard was right about one thing. Genuine faith is not comfort. It is not certainty. It is risk. It is a leap in the dark, knowing that you may be wrong. But it is a leap you take because the alternative, perpetual paralysis in indecision, is a way of not living. And similarly, genuine atheism is not arrogance. It is not certainty. It is also risk. It is a commitment to live as if the universe has no transcendent purpose, knowing that you may be wrong. But it is a commitment you make because the alternative, pretending certainty you do not feel, is dishonesty. So here's where we are. After examining all the arguments, after confronting the problem of evil, the ambiguity of evidence, the limits of reason, after recognizing that brilliant minds disagree and that assumptions shape conclusions, the question remains, does God exist? And the honest answer, the only intellectually honest answer is, I don't know for sure. No one does. You may have strong convictions on one side or the other. You may have reasons for your convictions. But absolute certainty, definitive proof, that doesn't exist. And having to live with that uncertainty is difficult. It's uncomfortable. It's unsettling. It's a source of anguish. But perhaps it's also liberating. Because if you don't have to be certain, you can stop pretending. You can stop building defensive walls. You can stop attacking those who disagree as if they were enemies. You can recognize that this is an issue where rational disagreement is possible, where sincere, honest, intelligent people can reach different conclusions. And you can have your convictions deep, sincere, without arrogance. You can live committed to your answer without dogmatism. That man at 3 in the morning finally understands. He will not resolve this issue tonight. Perhaps he never will. But he does not need to resolve it to live well. He needs to choose, not with certainty but with commitment. Choose what kind of person to be, what values to follow, what hopes to hold, what meaning to cultivate. And those choices can be informed by arguments, evidence, experiences. But in the end, they are his choices, not forced by irrefutable logic, not guaranteed by absolute certainty, just chosen, with honesty, with humility, with the courage to live despite uncertainty. And maybe that's what it means to be human. Not having all the answers, not knowing for sure about the most important questions, but living anyway, living fully, living authentically, living with commitment, not despite uncertainty, but through it. Because in the end, it's not certainty that makes life worthwhile. It's the meaning you choose to create. It's the love you choose to give. It's the hope you choose to maintain. Even especially when you don't know if the universe reciprocates. So the question is not, does God exist? The question is, how do you live in the face of this irreducible uncertainty? Do you live with faith, with hope that there is something beyond? Do you live with acceptance, with the courage to face possible emptiness? Do you live with doubt, with honesty about not knowing? All of these are legitimate ways of being human. All of these are ways of living authentically. And maybe, just maybe, the question was never about solving the mystery, but about how you inhabit the mystery, with honesty, with humility, with respect for those who inhabit it differently, and with recognition that this shared uncertainty, this search without definitive resolution, is part of what makes us human, part of what makes existence strangely beautiful, despite everything, or perhaps because of everything. What about you? Can you live without knowing? Or does uncertainty eat away at you? Can you maintain your commitment, whether faith or disbelief, without arrogance? Can you respect those who have chosen differently, recognizing that perhaps they are not stupid or dishonest, just humans inhabiting the same mystery by a different path? This is not a rhetorical question. It is an invitation to honesty. Leave your comments. How do you deal with uncertainty about ultimate questions? Do you have faith? Have you abandoned faith? Do you live in doubt? And more importantly, can you do so without despising those who are in a different place? Because maybe, just maybe, learning to live together in uncertainty is more important than resolving the question. Maybe that's what we need right now. Not certainty, but shared humility in the face of mystery.